everybody, welcome. You cracked the code and you get to be in the most exclusive panel of Balticon this weekend. Welcome to Writing Psychological Horror, an event almost as traumatizing as getting into this panel. We
just calling us all out immediately, John. Okay. Okay.
We are your merry band of thieves. My name is John Wiswell, and I'll be your moderator. I am a disabled writer who lives where New York keeps all its trees. I've generously had my property described as the set of the Blair Witch Project. I have written numerous horror stories. I am nominated for a Nebula and a Hugo for a not horror story about a haunted house that just wants to be nice to people rather than the bullying that they usually engage in. They're mean houses, but this one's a good house, friend. And I'd like to introduce everybody to our panelists. Please, Elle?
Hi, I'm Elle Marie Wood. I'm a psychological horror author. I also write screenplays. I've had 4 novels published. I just finished, literally said the end on my 8th novel yesterday, so I'm very excited about that. Right? Several short stories. I think I'm in the realm of about 150 short stories or something like that.
Oh.
And yeah, that's kind of crazy when you add it up like that. But screenplays, I've been diving into that recently and have been lucky enough to have a little bit of success there. So I'm kind of all over the place, and I have always written and have always read psychological horror. So I'm excited about this conversation.
Nino?
Hi, I'm still just in awe of 150 short stories. That's very, very cool. I'm Nino Cipri. I am an author most recently of the novella Fina and its sequel Defect. They're not exactly psychological horror. It's kind of like madcap adventure with the horrible the innate horribleness of working retail and a horrible capitalism kind of interfering, and then also wormholes and carnivorous furniture. So I have written horror as well, and next year in 2022 I'll be writing or publishing a young adult horror novel called Burned and Buried. I don't live in the Blair Witch Project. I live in New York City, but I grew up in Vermont in the house of a family whose daughter had been horribly murdered. And that was the major cachet of my social life as a child. It was just I lived in the murder house. So I've always had an abiding interest in horror, and psychological horror is included in that.
And Scott?
Before I say anything about myself, I will say more about Nino, who they should have pointed out that story is both a Nebula and Hugo finalist this year. I don't believe you said that, so we should do some applause for that. Congratulations.
Thank you.
But about me, 100 plus short stories, just sold 106, I think. And the most important thing to know about me is I am the Susan Lucci of horror at 0 and 8, 8 nominations and 0 wins. And if Josh Malerman had not won last weekend at StokerCon, there would have been no more Josh Malerman stories to be read by anyone, because he would have tied me, and I warned him that there can only be one of us. So it's more important to know that there'll be more Josh Malerman stories, because I would have murdered him, and that would have been the true psychological horror.
This is being recorded, Scott. So
right?
Well, but he won, so I stand alone as the losingest loser of the HWA.
I always love a good panel that could be entered into evidence. And Nick?
Yeah, I'm Nick Mamatas. I'm here to explain to anyone under the age of 90 who Susan Lucci is.
Yeah, my son. So
that is an aging reference, Scott. Susan Lucci was an actor in a soap opera who was nominated for the Emmy for many years and did not win that.
Yeah.
Name the soap opera.
That was all about. That's who that is.
Can you name
Otherwise,
it?
I'm a writer, an editor, and I've written some psychological horror. And I've written some things that I thought, oh, this is some realism. I'll send this off to realist journals. And they'd say, oh, why are you sending us psychological horror? So I guess that's part of why I'm here at this point.
Excellent. Welcome, one and all. So I wanted to broach tonight's topic by asking, what exactly attracted you folks to psychological horror, this particular niche and or subgenre? Because horror is very broad, and there's so much that can be done in it. Feels like the frontier is constantly being pushed. what was it about this particular thing of psychological horror that drew you in the first place? And has what appealed to you about it changed over time?
That's an interesting question. I think that I started writing psychological horror when I was literally 5 years old. And it's always been the subtlety, because, you know, at 5, I wasn't thinking about monsters and blood, and let's just put it out there. That wasn't, I mean, that was scary to me as a child, but that didn't mean that fear wasn't still intriguing. And the tension, more than fear even, the tension that exists when in a psychological horror tale, it's like mystery. You stretch it out, you know, there's clues and there's things to diagnose and figure out, and you know, you're running for this and something else is happening, and then, but it's all these different pieces. And I've always enjoyed that. I think that, you know, and I don't mean to, I'm not trying to say that it's easy to write, you know, a zombie, because it's not. I mean, not if you really want to make the zombie resonate, you know, but a psychological horror really tests you. It really brings in all these other genres, and it's just an enjoyable read for me. So the first story that I wrote was that kind of, hey, I want to write this story about this guy that thinks he's doing all these things, and then he wakes up, didn't do any of those things. And it was, right? But it was like really in depth and detailed, and you thought this was actually happening, and it was not. And I'm like, what a twist, you know? So I got to like the idea of the twist, but keeping that tension at the same time, so.
I think I came pretty late actually to psychological horror, not like 5 years old for sure. I was definitely as a kid much more into stories about like ghosts and zombies and monsters and vampires. And sort of, I think like in my teens, I became a snob in my teens, and I was like, I'm going to become the world's most famous filmmaker, and therefore I have to watch Alfred Hitchcock all the time. And so that period just sort of like started imbuing me imbuing an appreciation of it for me. And there was like a lot of like psychological suspense movies that came out in the 90s when I was also like, you know, that I would like take a break from Alfred Hitchcock to watch. I don't remember any of the titles, of course. And more recently, when I kind of like made this switch into like, you know, writing in a whole bunch of different subgenres, and then like really just starting writing a lot in horror and sort of adjacent genres, I started being really attracted to the pacing of psychological horror and like the way that it uses dread and anticipation and paranoia to sort of like slowly build up this like really horrible claustrophobic atmosphere in which you're just so tense throughout it. And I feel like it's a little bit trickier for me, at least, and it feels more satisfying to read for me than some other straightforward horror.
And I've always found what happens inside the boundaries of our heads to be far more terrifying than what happens outside the boundaries of our heads. And that's not to say that, well, zombies are cool and werewolves are cool and blood and gore and all that EC horror stuff. Another old thing that Nick will tell me is so old people don't remember it. But you know, those are all cool. But usually what those do not do, unless you marry it with the internal component, is those alone are not going to make the hair on your arm stand up. That's not going to make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. It's only when you're truly inside the head of the character and feeling what they're feeling and watching a slow build. Those things are far more terrifying than the others. So if you're really trying to scare a person, you're not going to give them that jump scare part after which they start giggling and laughing. That's what we do. You know, you're in a haunted house and the guy with the chainsaw jumps out at you and there's a moment of fear and then you all laugh together because it's that kind of fear. But if you really want the story to get at the reader, you got to go with the psychological horror and truly feel you know, the angst and the existential terror of just being alive. And then when you layer the external parts on top of it, that's when those external parts truly are terrifying.
That was like the quote of the day: existential terror of being alive. Excuse me, God.
I'll start singing from Company now. That's another old thing I'll pull in, right? Being alive. Nick.
I guess my interest comes perversely, and I'll be using the word perversely a lot in this panel, from my interest in hard science fiction. I don't write hard science, but I love to read hard science fiction, so I often approach stories in a hard SF way. So, oh, there's a ghost. Oh, how come I can't see a ghost in real life? Well, this ghost, well, he died when he was upset. Well, I've got a million Greek relatives. They're all upset all the time. I should see a million ghosts all the time. Nothing. Well, they died without getting what they wanted to do done. That's everyone. Nobody dies content and happy. Every bit of Europe that's covered in battlefields should be full of ghosts. We should be fucking silly with ghosts. So I find ghost stories pretty hard to take, even though I love them. But I can not really suspend my disbelief. And even when I write them, I tend to write, well, how come this ghost actually exists, or maybe this ghost is not a ghost. And so psychological horror, because it has that kind of that stream of realism through it, I find much more interesting just as a reader than a lot of supernatural fiction, which, in my point of view, either ends up not being horror. It could be scary in the way a car accident is scary, but I don't consider a car accident horror. I just consider like being in the middle of a fight or having some worries, but it's not horrific. But psychological horror is horrific to me in a way that supernatural horror is not, and that is why I enjoy reading it and occasionally writing it.
In the Q&A, Craig Cook came up with a great follow-up question to this, which I'd like to pose to everyone, which is psychological horror at all exclusive to other forms of horror, e.g. supernatural and gore? Which I'm going to say, no, it's not. But please, give me more than a no answer. What do you think?
All I was saying, like, let's fight about this.
Oh, okay, all right.
Not me and you, John. I'm just saying everybody.
So historically
speaking,
Nino. Psychological horror has been distinct from supernatural horror. That is why psychological horror is a term. To say, oh, it's not supernatural horror, it's psychological horror. So writers like Robert Bloch and the author of Psycho, what he would do is write things as though they were supernatural, that he'd use the same metaphors, the same turns of phrase. It would feel like a supernatural story. Even though the stories themselves were largely psychological stories. And it wasn't just weird menace. It wasn't like, aha, I'm actually just a nut. I'm not a ghost. It's not like Scooby-Doo or anything, but it felt preternatural. It felt abnormal and abnatural at the same time, but just while being psychological. Having said that, we have people like Robert Aikman, who is the fantastic author of supernatural fiction. He's written about vampires and werewolves and whatnot, but also he writes about things like a dollhouse. And the dollhouse doesn't quite seem shaped correctly. And inside the dollhouse, there's a room that you can't get to from inside the dollhouse. And I'm having dreams about this dollhouse and that crazy secret room. The end. So is it supernatural? In a way it is, because there are things that are impossible inside the dollhouse. But is it everyone's dream of having that weird room in your apartment or that old place you used to live and finding that crazy thing? Yes. So it's psychological and supernatural at the same time.
Yeah.
People don't point to Robert Aikman and say that's psychological horror. They say that's supernatural horror. But he happens to be interested in the abnormal psychology of the mid-20th century, and maybe a victim of the abnormal psychology of the mid-20th century, if you know anything about Robert Aikman.
Murray, you were going to follow up.
Yeah, I don't think that there's anything exclusive about it. I think that psychological horror can be anything. So in essence, I've written a vampire novel from a psychological horror perspective. I'm working on a zombie thing. I don't know what it's going to be, short story probably, from a psychological horror perspective. I think that you can include, because what it is psychological horror is really, if you think about it, and this is how it differs a little bit from quiet horror in and of itself, is that it's all about what's happening, what the perception is of your main character. So if my main character is a zombie, right, and they're going through whatever machinations as a zombie, but you're still getting the ability to think and see through the zombie's eyes. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm working out my plot right now. Let's see. But you get
and then what happened?
And then what happens, right? So you're going through that though, but you're still in all the focus and any of the relatability is going to come from a psychological horror perspective. And so in saying that, you can do whatever you want. You can touch upon any of the traditional antagonists. You can, there's extreme horror with psychological horror elements or vice versa. I just think it's a style of writing. I hate to put it that way because I really don't like these labels anymore. I feel like I've kind of, everything sort of merges together, and a good story, very much like a good speech, has all these different layers, and you're touching upon the emotional and the logical and all blah, blah. Same with writing. I feel like if you are writing a good story, that story is going to have a whole lot of elements. And it's not going to be, yes, you could put a label on it and say it's supernatural, but I don't know, read again, maybe it's not. Psychological horror could be the main focus with a ghost in sight. And therefore, it's like if Nick and I were to differ on that, and then two other people differ, now we're still having all these different perspectives. In the end, every reader is going to come away from every book with a different perspective. And that's kind of what we're writing to do, is to give people that escapism, and so they can sort of enjoy the story the way they would. So I don't think that there are any limitations, any exclusions whatsoever. I think that a writer can do what they want to do and still have it be from a specific perspective.
And of course, sometimes the psychological horror is lack of escapism. I know you say, Marie, about escapism. I mean, often what's happening with the psychological horror is that can be more shareable than the other kinds of horror. If we go back to those existential terrors. I mean, one of my zombie stories, to me, the reason it's so terrifying is eventually we live long enough, we will all be that. I had a story, what happens after I die and come back? Well, I'm shambling around the house, not recognizing the photos on the wall of my family and knocking books down off shelves, not knowing who wrote them. We will all lose the essential part of ourselves if you live long enough. That comes to us all. Yes, you too, Nick, even though you're nodding your head. I won't be here to see it, but it'll happen. So, so basically, when I bring that into, a story about a zombie, that is the thing that is universal, as opposed to the accoutrements, the way we describe the thing, the vampire, the werewolf, or whatever, the person with the dollhouse or whatever. Those are the particular, but the psychological horror is attempting to make it personal for the person in a way that they don't escape, that they look into their own fears, and hopefully helps them deal with the fear. You want them to come out and have some kind of resolution of them in a way, depending on how you're writing the things. But I think that's what makes it personal, that psychological part.
I have a question that I kind of want to pose to everybody, which is, how do you draw a line between psychological horror and psychological suspense? This is a question that people ask me, and I never know how to answer this.
Seriously, I don't think there is a line. I'll be honest.
No.
I toyed with, because you play around with what you're going to call yourself. Like, again, I'm sick of these labels today, right? But I just feel like I was like, okay, I'm going to change it from psychological horror, which obviously didn't happen. I'm just really married to that. I think that's just the best description of what I do. Yeah. But psychological suspense really fits this genre. It's not far-fetched. It doesn't. They're almost the same words. The difference is marketing, honestly, because people will pick up a book and say, okay, it's suspense. I don't like horror. I'm going to read the suspense novel. And it's the same daggone book.
Yeah.
I do wonder how much of it is like this perception of what reality is in that story, because I think in a lot of psychological horror, like the idea of like what is real is a little bit more blurry, right? Like, and sometimes really intentionally so. Like sometimes because like the narrator or the protagonist or just like some of the characters are in a place like where they're not necessarily able to trust their own senses or trust their own sense of what's going on. It's an unreliable narrative. And I think with suspense, like sometimes it's supposed to be a little bit more clear cut. Like there might still be the same twists and turns and like distrust and paranoia. But that sense of just like reality boundaries sort of like bleeding over, I don't think.
Well, since you're the one who said you watched all those Hitchcock movies, I would say we'll toss up Uncle Charlie and Shadow of a Doubt, right? For those who've seen Shadow of a Doubt, you would not define that movie as psychological horror. You would define that as psychological suspense. There's suspense to it. I personally, maybe some would define that as a horror movie, waiting to see what truth will be revealed and whether Uncle Charlie will get away with it, whatever Uncle Charlie gets away with without spoiling things or tries to get away with or whatever. But wouldn't you say that could not be classified as horror, but could be classified as suspense or psychological thriller or whatever words they used back then?
My Hitchcock period was more than 20 years ago, so I can weigh in on this.
When you were 3?
It's cute. It's real cute.
It's funny because like Shadow of a Doubt, I wouldn't have necessarily said was horror unless somebody else didn't, up until I became an uncle. And now that I have investment in an actual lifeblood young person, it's a horror movie. Now the horror. Sorry,
you're Uncle Charlie then?
I didn't say that I gained access to a young child and made them an accessory to murder.
Yet.
We got time.
It's recording.
We got time.
I'm like, point to the recording button again, please.
Yeah, that's right. Into just days before. So then this actually ties very nicely into a meaty question I wanted to discuss with you folks. How does antagonism function in psychological horror? Because in many other niches of horror, you're expected to either dread a monster that's coming after the characters or be on a lookout for a singular, possibly mysterious force of antagonism, whether it's a stalker or a secret society or a ghost. In psychological horror, the dread we're experiencing is often more surreal or blurrier. Is a singular antagonist or are singular antagonists useful in such plots? And if not, how does antagonism function in those stories?
I think
I
that's one
would
of the
say they are
distinctions.
useful in that. Oh, I'm sorry, Nick, you go ahead.
Sure. I can knock this back to Nino's question. I think that's one of the distinctions between suspense and horror. Now, I agree to a certain extent. It's who's your agent and what might sell. They will switch things around, will label it anything. But I do think psychological horror is often based on that normal psychology, even of the narrator or protagonist. The protagonist becomes the antagonist. Like, who was this crazy murderer? It's me. I was the crazy murderer all along. Shit. Like, that's horror.
Mhm.
If it's, oh, it's that guy over there. Luckily, I'm a cop. I can shoot him. That's suspense. So psychological, I mean, there's plenty of psychological horror where the antagonist is someone who is Hannibal Lecter. Right, who was a horror character who then becomes, over the course of the novels, a suspense character, and then becomes the protagonist. Because he kills people who are even more annoying and obnoxious than he is, right, which is a weird line for heroism, but there you go. But I mean, certainly there are plenty of things with this. Someone's an impeccable killer, or they're a torturer, they've got you in a basement. What's making them tick? I don't know. That's what makes it so frightening. If it's like, well, why are you trying to torture me? For information. That's suspense. Why are you trying to torture me? Oh, I don't know. Always like nipples, I guess. That's hard.
So I can't even finish my sentence.
Take that.
No, I was going to say that I love the idea of ghosts and utilizing them in psychological horror. So for me, because for me, again, I mentioned that a lot of what I write and a lot of what I've read in terms of psychological horror happens inside of the head. So is that, am I seeing that? Is that really happening? Is that really a ghost? Ghosts aren't real. I don't believe in ghosts. Okay, but what's going on? You know, and there's that, so you don't know that you can't trust. To get back to Nino's point, you don't know that you can't trust your own mind until you really can't, like until you're beyond, you know, any ability to believe what you think you know. And it's that path, that driving towards that end, that I love and find that you can use the ghost. I think the ghost is the best, you know, for that scenario that I just mentioned, but you can put the vampire in there, same idea. No such thing as vampires, but wait a minute, what's going on here? You know, what is wrong with my neck and why am I, you know, what's going on here, whatever. And so all these things could occur, and you've used psychological horror as your storytelling mechanism, and you're still doing it within this person's head, and all these other things are happening outside of you. So when you ask, John, how can you use antagonists? I think very, very simply, I think they easily emerge into, more so merging into our subgenre than us trying to apply our subgenre to something else, to another. It's like an easy, you know, it's just an easier way to bring them in, as opposed to attempting to put them on some extreme horror thing. And you can put it on extreme horror, but it's not, serial killers are trickier in that way because their motivations are different. So, you know, you have to really focus on where you're going with the serial killer, because if you don't think about what you're doing, you run the risk of creating some flat character that's so obviously, you know, not even scary. But if your goal is to write psychological horror, you could make that like something really, really devastatingly frightening. So.
And I would say that in psychological horror, the true antagonists are the friends we made along the way. Because that's always what we're thinking. We're saying, well, is this really my friend? Am I being gaslit? Is something going on here? And that's where the psychological horror comes in. And that's the real horror. You know, are the people I trusted people I can't trust? I always thought I could trust this person and I can't. Well, maybe I'm not. Maybe it's me. Maybe I'm imagining all these signs that I'm getting. That no, you shouldn't be imagining those signs. That's really what's happening. So you know, I do tend to think often that is what who the antagonists are. They're not the serial killer unless you're related to the serial killer, but they're not these strange things. I mean, the same way they say, most people are attacked by people they know, as opposed to strangers. If you look at the statistics, it could be the same thing in horror, and that's why it is psychological, but not because it's the person, it's because it's your internal distrust of your own emotions, and you're battling with, do I believe what I'm actually perceiving? So I think that's where you get that inner core of antagonists, and then you get to the strangers. But I think it's the friends and the relatives who cause the most trouble.
Scott, I'm also just looking at your background right now and thinking again, like, of Parasite, which I'm sure someone can argue like whether or not it's psychological horror, but like the antagonists in there, like who are the antagonists in Parasite? Is it the rich family that hires these people? Is it the like housekeeper and her husband who's just been like creepily living in the basement forever? Because there are different sources of violence in that movie. Like you don't know exactly like where the violence is going to come from and who is going to be directed at. So I think you can definitely have antagonists for like all the reasons everyone else has said, but also to like dig into the weird gray areas of who is the protagonist, who is the antagonist, who is the good guy in the scenario, and who is, quote unquote evil.
Yeah, well, the antagonist in Parasite is one of the broadest antagonists of all. It is capitalism.
I know, right? I love it. The ultimate goblin.
You ever pull off the mask, it's always capitalism. All right. Then I wanted to ask the group, what are common themes within psychological horror stories? And within those themes, are they generally handled differently here than in other kinds of horror?
One of my favorite, and the first that just occurred to me, is the idea of gaslighting, which, I mean, comes from the movie Gaslight, which is from 1930s, 1940s. I don't know off the top of my head, but has been like revisited and over again in psychological horror. One of my, like the two stories that I loved reading back to back were Charlotte Gilman Perkins' The Yellow Wallpaper and Carmen Maria Machado's The Husband Stitch, which is definitely not a realist story. There is some supernatural sense things going on there, but it's pretty subtle and in the background. Like it's a running theme through the book or the story, but you don't really know, like it's just sort of incorporated into the world so seamlessly that it doesn't feel supernatural. But constantly looking back at like what people believe is true and the relationships and the people and the forces in the world that cause them to question the things that they know are true, and the thing like constantly go back and distrust their own sense and like sense of themselves and their sense of their own story. Love that one.
I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of what happens and what themes occur or reoccur in psychological horror all the time. It's that distrust of self. I mean, you can't, you walk in thinking that you know what's going on. Often our main characters are not, having any outward struggle. Life was okay. They had a job, they were working, they were going about regular daily lives. And then all of a sudden something, so there's some inciting incident that happens, and then they begin to wonder what's happening, what is going on. And if I can see it, why can't anybody else see it? Why am I the person who's seeing it? What does that mean that I can see it? What do I do? And that's the rest of that's kind of the undercurrent. This gaslighting term is, to me, relatively new. The concept was always there, but the term being kicked around so often is just really, really a new thing. But in essence, we experience that in our daily lives. There's a reason it shows up all the time. There's always someone trying to make you think you literally don't know what you're talking about. Like you didn't see what you saw. That's not what this person meant. And it's goodness, it's insidious if you think about it. And that's how we end up with these characters who are just, I mean, in my mind right now, I'm seeing Renfield from Dracula. Do you remember how he was the 1930s one though? Like he was finished. That sound he would make every time he was looking for a bug. Like, do you recall what I'm talking about? I hope you guys know what I'm talking about. I can't do it because I can't do it, but look it up. It's awesome. But that's where our characters end up in their head, this headspace of, hey, listen, I see it and it's trying to kill me. I don't know why no one else can see this, but now I have to save myself because it's coming for me. And I think that it's a human nature type of thing that happens when we write stories like this. And it's a human nature, like we're sort of expressing ourselves on paper because someone has gaslit you in your life. You know, it's happened. You know, perhaps you've done it by mistake, or I mean, I don't want to believe anyone here has done that intentionally, but you may very well have done that and not realize the ramifications. And then you read something like this, or you know, it manifests in your writing, and you say to yourself, "Oh my goodness," you know, because that's the undercurrent, really. So, I mean, I hope I've answered that question. I'm kind of thinking that I might have been sort of dancing along the edge of it. So but I don't know.
Oh, I liked what you had to say. Scott or Nick?
I think it often connects to popular conceptions of psychology. So in the early 20th century, there's a lot of things about hysteria and other issues. In the mid 20th century, psychoanalysis in the US became huge. So of course you have books like Psycho I mentioned before. Oh, it was his mother all along. Mama did it, you know, that kind of thing. Try pitching a book like that now, you'd be laughed out of every publishing house in the country because it doesn't feel authentic anymore. Later on in the 70s, there was a fascination with multiple personality disorder, which now we call something else, DID. And everyone, oh, I've got 7 personalities and one's a murderer and one's a nun and that kind of thing. And now we're moving on to neurology, right? Where it's not something that from your childhood or your past or trauma, honestly, but it's, oh, something's wrong with your brain physically. And that has implications for stories. So I've seen many stories where, why is this person a killer? Why is this person so annoying? Why is this person the villain? Oh, something's wrong with the brain physically. So it's a weird way of trying to deal with these psychological innovations that we get from starting off with the academy, trickling down through the media where it gets sensationalized, and then we have to deal with it like, oh, am I a nut? Is my mother a weirdo? Am I hysteric? Do I get something wrong with my brain? And that's how we sort of deal with it by reading these stories. So where psychology goes, psychological horror follows along in sometimes horrifying ways outside of the text being horrifying, but just, is that how you think psychology works, really? Did you read one magazine article and you decided that's how you're gonna have your serial killer have this motivation? So there's some discontent in psychological horror too, where it comes from people just digging through the schools of psychology to find out, to give their villain a reason or to give their protagonist a way to be tortured.
Yeah, and if your question is meant to get into the ebbs and flows and evolution of psychological horror and the uses each generation puts to psychological horror, I would say that the biggest one at the moment that is the most mass market would be what Jordan Peele has presented us with Get Out and Us, and really, again, existential horror of being a person of color attempting to live in a white supremacist society is basically what that is. So so to say, oh yes, there are weird scientific supernatural things going on in both of those movies, but that is not what the horror is. The horror is not those things that are happening. The horror is just being the people in that that movie, in that situation, even without the supernatural elements that fantasy brings to it. So I would say that at the moment is the latest use that is being put to psychological horror, and perhaps the most popular as you look around the field.
You know, what's interesting about that is that it's also not new, that it's realistic horror. So this is the trend now. There have been other trends in the past that did realistic horror very well. You never know what the next version of this whole thing will be, but it's still sort of a subgenre of psychological horror, of all horror, really. Realistic horror is absolutely, you know, a real thing. It's a thing that when you're not dealing with something fantastic or something made up completely, you know, again, zombies. I don't know. I'm on zombies today. If you're not talking about that, you can pull from life. I mean, art imitating life is a reality for all authors of any genre, of any type. We're all pulling from real life. So in this example, you know, what Jordan Peele is doing is magnificent. I mean, his work, I think, is really, really worth watching. Anybody who has not watched needs to take a look at that. I mean, it's really, really good stuff, because gosh, if he didn't put psychological horror on the map, right? People didn't know that, because people didn't realize they were looking at it before, but now it's been called that so they can put their finger on something that they know they're looking at. But realistic horror is also a very real subgenre. And it fits very nicely within our group, our section of writing.
Mm. As we start to wind down on time, I wanted to ask us about endings, particularly catharsis in endings. Because psychological horror has a reputation for being just devastating to its characters. And I want to ask, is it possible for psychological horror to uplift characters or even audiences by delving into such harrowing themes, by yielding catharsis or something else? And if so, how can it do this?
As a person who likes the horrible ending, I guess. Okay, right? It is horror, and I prefer for it to be that. I prefer for it to live in its real space. And sometimes you can have a happy ending, but I really think that, that's not reality. That's not, if we've set up a scenario where there's an apocalypse, there's nothing all that happy after that. I mean, let's not, also if they found love in the ruins, all right, whatever. Like, that's not my goal. However, can that happen? Sure. Psychological horror is no different than any other genre. All of the things you can do with all of those genres can happen within psychological horror. If zombies can go to a prom, again with the zombies, but if they can go to the prom, which I saw on television, there were football player zombies. They had this, I couldn't believe it. I was like, what's actually happening? But
yeah, I grew up in Brooklyn. I remember those football player zombies.
Oh my God. But if they could go and do these things, then the door's wide open for anything. If you want a happy ending, happy may not be what everyone's thinking. The romance reader may not love the ending, and think it's the way it should end up. But for horror, it's a completely nice and happy ending for two zombies to run off in the sunset together and, kill together. I don't know, get brains together, whatever it is. That would be, if you find your brain mate, like your hunting mate, why not? But, it can be whatever it is. I think that the writer, the author has to create the story they want to create and not worry so much. I think this is also my message for the day. Don't worry so much about the tropes and the labels and the this and the that. Write the story that you're trying to write. Let it come out and see what it is. If it's a happy ending, then it is.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we were just talking about Get Out, which has one of the most cathartic endings in a movie that I've seen in a while.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Like cheers erupted out of the theater when I went to go see it. And I know too that like Jordan Peele apparently like wrote and maybe shot, I don't remember, a alternative ending where like, yeah, the protagonist was arrested and then was sent to jail, and like it was sort of more of a downer and he decided to flip it. So I think it's not just about like, what do you want to do, but also what does your audience want, and like what do you want to deliver to them? Because like sometimes I think that cold dose of nihilism or shitty reality is what your audience is after. Like we come to psychological horror because we like to hurt, we like to be hurt. I think that's fine, but sometimes they are also after like a more uplifting ending, and that's fine too. Like Marie said, or Elle said, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah, I mean, a lot depends on what kind of roller coaster you as the creator want to create for the people who climb in the roller coaster. Sometimes it comes to the end and everybody tumbles out laughing and goes off and get a hot dog and a drink. Other times it hits a brick wall and that's the end of it. And sometimes what you want to do for the reader is have them hit the brick wall. Sometimes the purpose of the story is to grab them and shake them, hit the streets or do something to change your life, or Franz Kafka stories to be an ice pick to the soul kind of thing. So I mean, a lot depends on what is the purpose of this concept I came up with, and that determines whether it's devastating. And often the devastation for the character is supposed to create a release for the reader to say, that ain't gonna happen to me. I'm gonna make a change. I'm gonna go out there and do something. So that all comes into play when you create whatever scenario you're creating.
So can it uplift the audience? I hope not, but probably, because people counter read. And I'll give another example from a film, not a psychological horror film, but the film Independence Day, which even though it's terrible, I saw it twice in the theater. It was very hot that summer. And I saw it once downtown in the Village when I was living in New York. And when the White House was blown up, people went, And then I saw it again with my other friend up in Washington Heights. And when the White House was blown up, people went, "Yay!" And if you know those neighborhoods, you can figure out why right away, why people were going, "Yes, blow up the fucking White House" in Washington Heights. So it depends on what you get. You can people the most devastating, horrifying thing in the world, and they'll be excited about it. Yes, this is what I want. I feel better now having gone through that threshing floor. Other people would be terrified about that. They want the happy ending. And for other people, have the happy ending feels false, feels like a lie.
Mhm.
And there can be something oppressive about these demands for happy endings in the minds of some readers. Thankfully, we have an enormous amount of stuff to read. Even if we all stop writing right now, and everyone who's hearing stops writing forever, you will not run out of books and stories that get you wherever you want.
Mhm.
Putting in is kind of like spicy food. One time at a convention, back when conventions were around, I went to the spicy food hot luck party, and I ate all my way up to the final shelf of spicy food, which said, and it was a jar. It was like an inkwell, had a volcano on top and a skull, and it said, "Insanity sauce, do not eat, not a food product." So I pulled the thing off and I put it on a nacho, and the little plastic thing on the top said, "Not food, don't eat," and I ate it. And it was bad.
Mm.
It was very bad. I ran to the bathroom and I drank a quart of milk, puked that right up, felt everything again. Half a loaf of bread, that didn't help. I went screaming into the hallway, trying to find my friend, trying to explain what was going on. I couldn't speak, turns out. Felt it in my body for about a week and a half.
Ugh.
And you did that
And
to
then
yourself.
Yeah.
You chose that.
And so when I tell the story, what people do to me, they give me hot sauce recommendations. They say, "Oh, so you like hot sauce, huh? Well, I've got one for you."
Oh my goodness.
And that's kind of what psychological horror can be like.
John, if I could say something real quick to that, Nino made me think of when talking about the Get Out and the ending and how it was just fantastic. I mean, I cheered in the theater, I cheered in the house, I've cheered every time I watched it. But if for anybody who's thinking about writing psychological horror in the audience, I just want to say, think about that ending and then go back and watch the original, the very first Night of the Living Dead, and think about that ending.
Mhm.
Which one do you want? Because that ending is so powerful.
Mhm.
And it means something different for everyone. As an African-American woman, when he slapped her, I thought, oh God, not gonna go right. And at the end, I kept thinking, oh, you could see something was gonna happen. And it was an excellent zombie movie. Sure, zombies again. Excellent zombie movie, excellent story. At the end, the whole thing, and it made sense. I probably would have written it the same way, but it hurt. It hurt. And when Get Out happened and the scene was different, and I kept thinking that my mind went back, like, I don't know what to tell you to do, but don't, like, back away, don't do it all. They can't do it all. And when the police car pulls up, I kept thinking, that's it. Here we go again. This is it. And it was different, and it felt better. It felt much, and the story was horrible. What a horrible, that was so harrowing to watch that whole thing. But at the end, I was like, yeah, that's right. So you have to think to yourself, what do you want your reader to walk away with? And that's a decision you have to make. None of us can tell you that. And all of us will have different motivations when we sit down to write our story. So I just wanted to leave that there.
It's a great note. We are now past the 10-minute warning. So I'd like to ask something that the audience has asked a couple of times now. Are there any psychological horror stories that you count among your favorites that haven't come up so far? Would you help build folks' reading lists? And I'm just, as the moderator, I'll make a little time for you folks to just say, everything that Caitlin Kiernan has ever written is my favorite psychological horror thing. I might start with The Red Tree or Drowning Girl. Drowning Girl is asks that terrible question, is she crazy or is she haunted? And answers it with yes. Both, which I deeply appreciated on a visceral level. But what about you folks? What hasn't come up that you would recommend folks read within this realm?
The short story, The Dog Park by Dennis
Oh, go
Etchison.
ahead, Nick.
The short story, The Dog Park by Dennis Etchison is my favorite psychological horror. And it's quiet and it doesn't have a supernatural element. And it's about LA, and I hate LA, so it works out on all these levels.
And based on our conversations, there's going to be a debate as to whether this is psychological horror or not, or whether it's something else entirely. But one of the first things that came to mind as we were talking about this was Victor Laval's The Changeling, which to my mind enters the realm of psychological horror and the things that the protagonist is going through in it. But it's a magnificent book and well worth tracking down.
I'll just +1 on that. It's so good.
My favorite is Quietus by Vivian Schilling. That book, I remember I was writing my first novel when I got my hands on it, and that's the first time I've ever reached out to an author, like totally fangirling. I was like, I just loved it. And she was gracious enough to not, help me embarrass myself any further. She was so kind. Quietus by Vivian Schilling. Fantastic story.
I'm coming up with a total blank, and it's really embarrassing right now.
We covered a lot of ground. I would make one more shout out. The movie, and it was a movie that made me realize that this was a genre that I needed to consume a lot more of, was Satoshi Kon's Perfect Blue. Nino, would you like to talk about Perfect Blue?
No, because I haven't seen that since I was like 15.
Well,
I'm overdue for a rewatch though.
It holds up. It's better now than it was then because our culture has just become more toxic. But I mean, it is about a pop idol who wants to change careers and start moving on with their life, and what happens to her fans who are too attached to her, what happens to her own identity when the only opportunities she's given are by people who are looking to exploit her, and the murders that start happening around her life at the same time as she starts to see visions of herself, of her old pop idol self dancing in the window and possibly at a crime scene. It's a masterpiece, and because of the way we've become even more obsessed with celebrities over the internet, this movie feels even more prescient now. Satoshi Kon was obviously brilliant, but that's another thing I give a shout out for.
Thanks for those. I wrote little notes for those. I'll be picking some of that up.
I will give kind of a half recommendation, I think, for the movie Cam.
I love Cam.
Yeah. Is it I mean, it's one of those ones where it's you don't know exactly what is going on, and it never bothers to break it down for you, which is my favorite thing in horror. I don't need the explanation. But yeah, it's about a cam girl who sort of like Perfect Blue, and that's what triggered the memory. Basically loses her identity as a cam girl. She suddenly starts seeing her channel is taken over by somebody who looks like her, acts like her, can do all the things that she does, and she's struggling to regain control over her image and her identity. And it's really, really cool.
Yeah. That's on Netflix, I believe.
It sure is.
So super easy to access.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the more divisive movies of the last year or the year before, because I'm sure that some people loved it and some hated it, but it'll make you extremely uncomfortable, is Ari Aster's Midsommar, which is certainly in the realm of psychological horror. But I know there's a split about people who loved it or hated it, but it made me feel deeply uncomfortable. It's one of those when you go, what the hell am I watching? In a good way for me. I'm one of the people who happen to enjoy the extremely bizarre experience, and I see someone's popping up Hereditary also is one there. Again, I think even though there may be elements that are not purely mimetic, I think they enter the realm of psychological horror.
The first half of that movie is psychological horror, and then the second one is supernatural horror, and the supernatural half just is not quite as good.
Okay, we have a minute and a half. If we can, please quickly tell everyone where to find you. Elle?
I'll go.
Okay.
No, Nino.
I am, you can find me at elmariewood.com. I'm on Twitter at elmariewood1 and at facebook.com/elmariewood.
My website is ninocipri.com. It looks super basic right now. WordPress is screwing with me. I am mostly on Twitter at Nino Cipri. You can also find pictures of my cat and occasionally things I bake on Instagram at wingnuttery, and I will just add that to the chat.
And I am at Scott Edelman on Twitter, scottedelman.com. And also, if you're not sick of the sound of my voice already, there are 145 episodes of the Eating the Fantastic podcast live, in which I share food with various luminaries within the field and talk about their careers.
Nick?
And I was on an episode of that podcast, so look for that. But I have a distinctive surname, so just type in Mamatas and you'll get me.
And I am just my last name on Twitter, Wiswell. I'm johnwiswell.blogspot.com if you want to find more stories by me. And I'll be doing programming thread tomorrow. Thank you all. Thank you all so much for coming. And thank you all for being wonderful panelists. That was awesome.